Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising on the 22nd of August, 2025. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to talk today about the unfolding drama in Ukraine, principally. I also want to touch on what's going on in the Middle East and in particular in Gaza. I've had a number of requests over the last couple of weeks to offer my perspective principally on what's unfolding in Ukraine. So over the next hour or so, I will endeavor to do that and then touch on events in the Middle East, as I said. I think the framework for understanding recent events in Ukraine has everything to do with the Trump administration trying to keep the Jeffrey Epstein scandal out of the headlines. Jeffrey Epstein, as you all know, ran a sex ring for many decades that was intimately involved with Donald Trump and other leading figures in Wall Street, in Washington and New York, among the political and wealthy elite. It touched on people going as far back as the Clinton administration onwards. It is a scandal of literally epic proportions, far more damaging and dangerous than Watergate, which was very specific, very localized to an event that took down a presidency. The Epstein scandal certainly implicates Donald Trump, as I've mentioned on previous occasions. But it also implicates essentially the political and economic elite of the United States of America. It implicates the Mossad, the CIA, the Israeli Central Intelligence Agency, MI6 in the UK. There are many indications that Mossad and the CIA were intimately involved in the international sex trade, specifically in part to provide young girls, many of whom were prepubescent, to political and business leaders with the specific intent to film them and to compromise them. Trump ran on releasing the Epstein files. It's well known that when Epstein was arrested, that the FBI seized several several like vaults full of videotapes and transcripts and photographs that, according to what I've read, if you kind of put them into pages, would come to 80 million pages. Epstein sought to photograph virtually everything because that was part of his job for Mossad and the CIA and various other interests in the Israeli lobby that were seeking to maintain control over the US government so it would continue to support Israel. So Jeffrey Epstein was a highly amoral, malevolent man. And Donald Trump was his good friend for many, many years until they had a breakup of some sort. But even after that, Trump was engaged. And so what has been going on in Washington over the last 4 to 6 weeks is a desperate attempt to keep Epstein and the growing scandal underneath his feet out of the front pages. This is important in understanding why he sent troops to where I'm living in Washington, D.C., and gathered National Guard troops from various Republican-controlled states around the country. That's the reason why he has done most of what he's been seeking to do. And then recently, in very short order, to the surprise of everyone, he got in touch with the Russians and said, I need a summit. I need a summit. And the Russians obliged, as we all know. And several weeks ago, Vladimir Putin and his entourage and Donald Trump and his entourage met in Anchorage, Alaska. I want to now transition from this Epstein context to what is now unfolding, because even though, as we know, no great act is ever done for a single reason. It may be reactive to Epstein, but it's happening within a larger context. And so the impulsive action of Trump in an attempt to keep Epstein off the front pages has actually now started a chain reaction that is now moving beyond Trump's control. And I'd like to just lay out, in my view, in the spirit of truth pursued, not truth possessed, what I think is going on. It's very interesting. I think there were three outcomes of the Anchorage summit. The first was symbolic. After 3 years of war, during which, since 2021, so really 4 years, during which the US President Joe Biden and all the Europeans refuse to have any contact with the Russians. The first time in the history of American-Russian relations that an American president absolutely refused to have any contact with the leader of the most powerful nuclear weapons state in the world. This is very important to note. This marked the first time when an American president and a Russian president sat down in the aftermath of the Ukraine war. So symbolically, seeing Trump and Putin shaking hands and getting in a limo together and having the meetings and then having a press conference. It's happened dozens of times before. You know, when Kennedy met Khrushchev in Vienna in 1961, and Nixon went to Beijing and met Mao, and then to Moscow and met Leonid Brezhnev, and all the subsequent Gorbachev and Reagan and Gorbachev. That was the custom until Biden broke the rhythm. And just imagine how the world would be different if, instead of cutting himself off from Vladimir Putin, Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin would have met once every 6 months, once a year even, to try to sort out a war that was destabilizing the world. So Trump took that step in many ways like Nixon did, was heavily criticized. But symbolically, what it indicated was that Russia and the United States are in the process of beginning the process of normalization. And that's what they both want. Secondly, and very importantly, Trump came away clearly stating that a ceasefire was not going to happen, that sanctions were not going to happen. And thirdly, that a peace process now needed to unfold. This was heralded as a great victory for Vladimir Putin, and to some extent it was. Putin got everything he wanted. He's never agreed to a ceasefire. He certainly doesn't want more sanctions. And he wants a peace process. So in that sense, Putin had the upper hand in Anchorage, recognized by Trump. And the reality, which we'll get into in a few minutes more deeply, the reality is that Donald Trump had no choice. And he has no choice because the United States is out of capacity to help Ukraine. And the United States has no enforcement mechanisms, either through sanctions or any other means, short of thermonuclear war, of making the Russians do anything they don't want to do. Why? Because the Russians have won on the battlefield. And you remember that's what I said 6 months ago when there was all this talk about a ceasefire, and that's what Trump was going to do. I said, there's going to be no ceasefire. That's not how wars end. Wars always end on the battlefield. And the ceasefires and the peace treaties then codify what has taken place on the battlefield. That's what happened in Vietnam. They had all these talks in Paris and they argued about whether the table should be round or square for 6 weeks, and they kept going and nothing made any difference until it was clear that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong had won on the battlefield. And then the negotiations were over and a peace settlement ensued. That's how wars end. Sometimes, and this is what the neocons wanted, they wanted a Korean-style ceasefire and freeze. So they were saying, freeze at the current front lines for both sides, and we'll continue to arm Ukraine like we're arming South Korea, and then there'll be the Donbass and so forth. It'll be armed by the Russians, and there will be perpetual war in Ukraine. Why do they want that? Because the military-industrial complex can keep feeding the machine. And the Russians said, no, that's not going to happen. So the startling revelation that is occurring among the Western European and American political elites, the media, which is so far behind, they can't even find themselves, is that for the first time, the West is getting to understand what the Russians have been saying all along. And just take a moment and think back over the last 3 years, 3.5 years. There's been a news blackout of anything coming from Russia. There's been no contact with Russia. If anybody says anything critical of the war, they're an agent of the Kremlin. They're a Putinist. I can't tell you how many times I've been called an agent of the Kremlin or a Putinist because I'm questioning what's going on. So what's been happening in effect in the media and among the political elites is the Americans and the Germans and the French and the Italians and the British have been negotiating among themselves. They haven't been negotiating with the Russians. The Russians have been just inexorably winning the war through this extraordinarily brilliant, actually, strategy of attrition, which if we have time, I can go into in more detail. So what is coming into the consciousness now since the summit in Anchorage is all of a sudden people are taking in that the Russians have a certain point of view. It starts with no ceasefire. So I'd like to explain, just so everyone's clear, what the Russian point of view is and how things are going to play out given the victory of the Russians on the battlefield. Vladimir Putin gave a speech on June 24th, 2024, to the foreign ministry in Russia, during which he laid out the Russian position. He'd articulated it in various ways since actually before the beginning of the war. The Russians have never changed their position. But in June 24, at that speech to the Russian foreign ministry, Putin laid it out. And what the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and all the Russian officials have been saying over the last couple of days in the news, if you're tracking everything, all goes back to that June 24 speech just over a year ago in Moscow. The first and most important point that the Russians have been saying, and not just Putin, but since Gorbachev, and the reason why they so fundamentally oppose a ceasefire along the Korean model is that 75 years after the Korean War, they're still in a state of war between each other. And the Russians have been saying since Gorbachev, we need a comprehensive peace agreement where our security and your security and everybody's security can be negotiated and we can have normal relations. If I had to distill down the most fundamental plea, I would say, of the Russians since Gorbachev is to simply have normal relations. As Yeltsin and Putin put it after Gorbachev, we're not even communist anymore. We wanted to be treated like every other country. Why can't you treat us like Canada? Why can't you treat us like France, Germany? Why don't we talk about Russia joining the EU or NATO? They wanted normalization of relations and the United States refused to give it to them. Because the neocons that have controlled the presidencies, Democrat or Republican, hasn't made any difference, and the Congress, and the foreign policy establishment, wanted to take NATO to the east, seize Ukraine, seize Georgia, and break up Russia. That has been the plan since the 1990s and the collapse of the Soviet Union in December of 1991. And the United States, even with the collapse of the Soviet Union, wouldn't give up its desperate need for full spectrum dominance over the world, which required the breakup of Russia. If you understand that, you understand everything that has basically happened in terms of the conflict. The Russians have wanted normal relations, and the Americans want full spectrum dominance in the breakup of Russia. And the whole thing came together in the tragedy of Ukraine. So that's what Putin has said to Trump. And it's commonsensically what should be done. We should be getting along with everybody. I don't have to like the wart on the end of your nose. You don't have to like the wart on the end of my nose. But we can at least just get along. We don't have to devilize each other and project all our shadow contents to each other and then fight each other to the death. And that's why Gorbachev took the heroic step of withdrawing all the Russian troops from Eastern Europe, allowing Germany to be reunited, dissolve the Warsaw Treaty Organization so there was no alliance for Russia in Eastern Europe, in the expectation if they did that, the Americans would respond. And as Gorbachev put it, they would negotiate the beginnings of a global civilization. And Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Bush Sr., Bush Jr., Clinton, Obama, Biden, Trump even wanted this full spectrum dominance. The difference between Trump and the other presidents is not that he understands what's going on. He does not. But he understands one thing, and that is that the United States is not in control anymore. His instinct for power has made it clear to him, I think only intuitively, as Marco Rubio said in one of his first statements after he became Secretary of State. He said something that no Secretary of State has ever said, that it's time for the United States to recognize it's no longer the unipolar power and that we're moving into a world of multipolarity. That was seismic. The American century is over. American primacy is done. So even if Trump wanted to help Ukraine more, let's say like Biden, it wouldn't change the outcome at all. The Russians defeated the Ukrainians during the Biden regime, and they're now defeating the Ukrainians under Trump. So the fundamental way to understand what's going on is this recognition by the president that we're not in charge anymore. I want to get out of here, but he doesn't want to be blamed for Ukraine's defeat. And now a peace process is underway with no ceasefire and no sanctions, which is going to focus everything on Ukraine and the bilateral relationship now between the Ukrainians and the Russians. That's where it's all going to end up. So that's the first thing that the Russians keep saying. We need to sit down and negotiate an overarching peace agreement that takes into consideration everybody's security needs, economic and political, so that we can have normal relations. The second thing they're saying specific to Ukraine is that Ukraine must be neutral. And thirdly, that Ukraine cannot enter NATO. I mentioned before that in its constitution in 1991, as it became for the first time in its entire history an independent country, the Constitution declared Ukraine as a neutral country. Everybody was happy. The Russians, who had ceded to Ukraine Crimea under Khrushchev in the 1960s to kind of regularize the map, were perfectly happy for the Ukrainians to keep control of Crimea and Sevastopol as long as the Russians had free access. And the Russians, if my memory serves me correctly, were paying a certain fee to be able to use the Crimean ports. Everybody was happy. There were no conflict. But the Americans, intent on expanding eastward, wanting to seize Ukraine to deprive Russia of its access to a warm water port, began in the mid-2000s to destabilize Ukraine, particularly in 2008, when George Bush insisted that NATO declare officially that Ukraine was going to be absorbed into NATO next. And that's when Vladimir Putin said no. That's a red line. That is not going to happen. And the rest, as they say, is history. So the second and third points are very simple and straightforward. Ukraine needs to return to neutrality where it started. And the Ukrainians cannot enter NATO because the Russians don't want US nuclear weapons right on its border in its southern flank. Another very, very important point for the Russians, and I think not only for the political elite in Russia, but also for the average person in Russia, is the restoration of all rights to all Russians in Ukraine in the aftermath of the extraordinary repression by the Ukrainians of Russian culture, the Russian language, the Russian Orthodox Church. They've banned the Russian Orthodox Church. They've made illegal any speaking of Russian. They're the only country in the world that has actually banned the language. You just think of Israel banned Arabic in the West Bank. That's the equivalent to what the Ukrainians have done to the Russian language and Russian culture. They've sought to just stamp it out. Why? Because that's exacerbating the tensions with the Russians, which is what the neocons in the United States want. So that there's conflict. so that they can feed into that military industrial complex another country that's going to be chewed up in this insatiable addiction to war that characterizes the military industrial complex of the United States and increasingly Europe. So the restoration of the Russian Orthodox Church, the restoration of the Russian language, again, treating anything Russian as normal, not special, normal. Normalization is the way the Russians have put it on multiple occasions. The final thing that the Russians have been demanding is that Ukraine be denazified and essentially demilitarized. They've said from the beginning, and if you remember, this was part of Putin's justification for going into Ukraine in the first place. He said essentially Ukraine's been taken over by neo-Nazis. And that's exactly the case. That's the Azov Brigade. Those are the people who are insisting that Ukraine go down fighting to the last man and the last woman, rather than any kind of ceasefire or any kind of peace agreement. They are the ones who've spearheaded the de-Russification of Ukraine. Like the Germans, they hate the Russians. And so there's an ideological infection in Ukraine that the Russians are demanding be cleansed as part of any normalization process. Germany did this after the Second World War. Germany eliminated the Nazis. It was illegal to publish any books about the Nazis or speeches about Hitler. They denazified. Not totally, but relatively thoroughly. And the Russians are saying that's what needs to happen in Ukraine. Because from a domestic point of view, and it's one of the reasons why Ukraine was judged by the UN to be among the most corrupt countries in the world, and this is prior to the war, is because of the infestation of neo-Nazis in the society and politic of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian nation. It's a serious issue for the Russians. So those are headlines, really, about what is now emerging for all of us to consider as for the first time since the war started. We're beginning to hear the Russian point of view. And that leads me to the bottom line for why this is going to take place, more or less along what I just said. We may not get an overarching peace agreement because the Europeans and the Americans are still completely opposed to it. They want to keep the hostilities going, as does Trump, who's supplying Ukraine, as I speak, with all the weapons and with all the money that it needs, all the intelligence that it needs. So Trump is feeding the war. They don't want a big peace agreement with the Russians. They want hostility with the Russians, but they want to freeze the conflict in Ukraine along the lines of the Koreans, North Korea and South Korea. That has been the plan. That's the logic behind everything that you've heard about ceasefire, ceasefire. Why won't the Russians have a ceasefire? Not only does it not solve any of the problems that need to be solved, it defies the logic of the battlefield. And here I want to just pause and cite some data that's beginning to emerge both from Ukrainians and from Russian hackers who've penetrated the Ukrainian general command. Apparently, what's emerging is that the Ukrainians are losing between 80 and 85% of their infantry troops to death or casualties of sufficient severity that they can no longer fight, leaving 10 to 15% of the troops, 15 out of 100, say, able to continue in the conflict. The data is completely the opposite for the Russians. About 80% of their infantry is intact, and they lose 15, 20% to casualties, either death or wounded with such severity that they can no longer continue to fight. That gives you a sense of the asymmetry on the battlefield and the reason why the Ukrainians are losing battle after battle after battle. Desertion rates are going up. Whole platoons and little brigades are just leaving the battlefield. And this Russian war of attrition that concentrates not so much in seizing the mountaintop as killing the enemy and inexorably moving forward is paying dividends. And many experts believe that the Ukrainians will collapse sometime in the fall, and that the Russians, when they win this current battle in a place called Pokrovsk, which is considered by most military analysts to be the crucial town, which, when lost, opens up to the Russians the rest of the Donbass. And then they sweep to the Dnieper River. Now, this leads me to a final point on Ukraine. The Russians are clear. The longer the Ukrainians resist the obvious, the more territory they're going to lose. Putin has talked about taking Odessa, which was founded by Russians under Catherine the Great. Putin has talked about taking Kharkiv, beyond the Dnieper River. There are Russian cities. So the basic message to the Ukrainians, you either surrender now and lose 20% of your land, the 4 oblasts, the 4 provinces, and we stop, let's say, at the Dnieper, or if you keep fighting and fighting, we're going to take Odessa. And if the Russians take Odessa, Ukraine becomes landlocked with no access to the Black Sea. And it becomes a rump state, literally on the verge of not being viable. Is that what the Americans and the Europeans want? So that's why I said the reason why Trump is withdrawing from Ukraine is he's got no cards. all the weapons that Joe Biden and Trump have given to the Ukrainians, the most sophisticated weapons in the world, have had no effect. The Russians have neutralized all of them. There's been a lot of discussion, just to give a quick example, there's been a lot of discussion about the Ukrainian drones, and the Russian drones, and how the Ukrainians are sending all these drones. The reality is that the corruption in Ukraine and the political machinations of Ukraine created a situation in which Ukrainian groups would decide they were going to develop their own drone, sell it onto the market. But there was no standardization. So you got all these drones being produced in these little factories, maybe with 20 people, that sooner or later get wiped out by the Russian drones. And one of the complaints from the Ukrainian soldiers on the battlefield, they'll get more drones, but it doesn't work on the system that they had to adjust to shoot the other drones. Meanwhile, the Russians are producing drones by the tens of thousands in massive factories. And they have contracted with a tech company that's hired 65,000 young men and women, techies, to fire the drones and to regulate the drones and to target the drones that are attached to these different units. All the drones work in a single integrated system. And that's why the Russians control the sky and control the battlefield. And they've become superbly sophisticated at using drones against the Ukrainians. And yet the Europeans and the Ukrainians refuse to acknowledge what I just said. And they're demanding that Donald Trump continue the war. When Donald Trump understands there's no war to be won. And yet the momentum of the neocon mentality is so strong that the machine just keeps going. And the Ukrainians die by the thousands. And one of the oldest countries and regions in Europe, the breadbasket of Europe, is being completely destroyed. What we're witnessing in the debacle of Ukraine is the greatest failure of statesmanship in Europe since the failure to deal with Hitler in the 1930s. And the whole system collapsed. And at some point over the next 4 to 6 months, this collapse is going to accelerate. And then what? At that point, the Russians will have taken 20%, which they currently have, plus X. And those will be then the new boundaries that will be negotiated. But the outcome is going to inevitably have Ukraine as neutral, not joining NATO, the Russian culture and language rehabilitated. And depending on how long it's going to take for the Ukrainians to wake up to the obvious and sue for peace, they may be a viable state or they may be a non-viable state. because the Russians would have taken Odessa or not. And this is why Putin was so upbeat in Anchorage and so casual and so relaxed. As I've said many times before, he holds all the cards. And not just in Ukraine, but internationally. He's being supported by nearly 100 countries around the world, in particular, China, India, Iran, South Africa, Brazil, the biggest countries in the global South, have aligned themselves with the Russian position. And so when Trump, a month or two ago, threatened India and threatened China with bone-crunching tariffs, as Senator Lindsey Graham had put it, the Chinese and the Indians just shrugged it off. The sanctions don't mean anything. And so Trump is flopping around thinking he's the president of the United States and the greatest powerful man in the world. And he isn't. Because the rest of the world understands that the emperor has no clothes. So that's as concisely as I can put the matter of what's going on in Ukraine. It will unfold inexorably toward a complete Russian victory. And at some point, the Europeans and the Ukrainians are going to give up and recognize the obvious. And then whatever the realities there, then on the ground and diplomatically, they will negotiate a settlement. And the Ukrainians will have suffered a tragic, completely unnecessary destruction of their country and their culture. They actually believed Joe Biden and Anthony Blinken and the Europeans that they were going to be given all the weapons they needed to defeat the Russians. And they weren't. And now, as I predicted over 3 years ago, the Americans are just going to walk away. We're watching it in slow motion. Just like we did in Afghanistan, just like we did in Iraq, just like we've done in dozens of other countries, like we did in Vietnam. We're walking away and leaving a catastrophic legacy. Which brings me to the genocide in Gaza. What I've just detailed about Ukraine pales into insignificance, truly, in comparison what Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu are doing as they begin the final solution of the Palestinian problem in Gaza. You've heard over the last several days that the Israelis have massed 65,000 reservists for the final assault on Gaza City, a small little town that the Israeli defense minister says is going to be razed to the ground. After months of systemic starvation, when most of the people can barely move around, they're going to come in and start mass slaughter and the mass destruction of everything. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, that has been running the 4 food centers which is the only place that the Gazans can get food, and they're being shot by the dozens every day. Sometimes 100 or more people are shot every day, kids, women. The Israeli Defense Force just released their own analysis that 83% of all the casualties since the war began have been children. That's not an accident. This is part of the extermination of the Palestinians. And one of the things that this Gaza Humanitarian Fund contractor who's been on the news, I forget his name at the moment, has been saying is that the Israeli snipers have been intentionally shooting children, either in the groin or in the pelvis. Children. And now what's the plan is, as they starve 2 million people, the Gaza Humanitarian Fund that was set up for food, run by the United States and Israel, are in the process of building massive concentration camps for up to 500,000 people. So they're going to completely raze Gaza to the ground, just like they did to hundreds of villages and towns in 1948 when they pushed 750,000 Palestinians out of the lands that Israel had seized, many of whom ended up in Gaza. They razed them to the ground and rebuilt Jewish settlements and Jewish towns and cities. They're doing that to Gaza. And as soon as they get the concentration camps done, which are going to be right there by the Egyptian border, they're working hard in a country almost as corrupt as Ukraine to buy off the government to allow hundreds of thousands, ideally 2 million Palestinians, to rush out of the horror of Gaza into the parched desert of the Sinai. And then the border will be sealed, and a Jewish settlement will spring up all over Gaza. And the West Bank is going to be annexed. And there will be the extermination of the people on the West Bank, as they'll be forced out of the West Bank one way or another. I want to conclude with an insight that has come to me as I've pondered why Israel and the United States have bonded so inextricably, such that the United States has become a tool of Israeli foreign policy. And the Mossad and the CIA essentially are intertwined and work as one. And I offer this as a challenge to all of us to think about. This is what's been occurring to me. I think the seed kernel of what was shaped by the neocons in terms of full spectrum dominance by the United States over the world had a parallel process in Israel. when in the mid 1990s, right about the time when the neocons were seizing control of the US government and foreign policy, Netanyahu was articulating the same full spectrum dominance plan for Israel in the Middle East, whereby working with the United States, Israel and the United States would sow chaos in the Middle East, overthrowing at least 7 countries that I've enumerated before: Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Lebanon, Somalia, Sudan, and Northern Africa, and Iran. If you could destabilize the whole region, Israel could use the chaos to create Eretz Israel, the greater Israel, which was envisioned by Netanyahu and the neocons of Israel as including not only Gaza and the West Bank, but parts of Jordan, parts of Syria, and parts of Lebanon. Israeli troops today have overrun southern Syria and are on the outskirts of Damascus. Israel has completely destroyed southern Lebanon, in part with phosphate bombing that kills everything. Israel is about ready to annex the West Bank. They're into the final solution of the Palestinians in Gaza. So what has aligned the United States and Israel is a mutuality of full spectrum dominance ensured by creating chaos, taking over Europe, destabilizing Ukraine, breaking up Russia, so that out of the chaos, the United States globally and the Israelis regionally could work together to control the world. Jewish supremacy and American supremacy. Rules okay. That's been the plan. That's been the plan. Yuval Harari, the great Israeli public intellectual, maybe the best known public intellectual in the world, has said that what's going on might be the greatest catastrophe in all of Judaism, because Judaism is being destroyed by what's going on in Israel. And as he explains it, it makes sense. 2,000 years ago, after the Romans defeated the Maccabean revolt and expelled Jews from Jerusalem, and the great diaspora, the great scattering of the Jews began, the response of the rabbinic scholars was to accept the diaspora and say to the Jews, we need to adapt, become a people amongst the Gentiles, and concentrate on learning and scholarship and how we preserve ourselves as a people. What's happened since the Zionists articulated Zionism is what has replaced this Talmudic wisdom and learning and elegance of spirit that characterized the Jews for several thousand years. It's being replaced by Jewish supremacy and a nation state predicated on genocide, ethnic cleansing. And Yuval Harari says this transposition of value, sure, Israel will survive as a country and probably maintain military superiority, but at what cost to the Jewish soul? Because Judaism now is linked with genocide. Judaism is now linked with Jewish supremacy. And that is a tragedy that deepens when you begin to reflect on a final thought that has occurred to me as I've pondered as deeply as I can these issues. Hitler won the Second World War. He lost the battle, but he won the war because the toxicity of Nazism, of Aryan supremacy, of genocidal extermination against the Jews wasn't vanquished. It entered into the very people that he was seeking to exterminate. And now the Israeli government is treating the Palestinians exactly the way the Germans treated the Jews. The photographs of the starving children in Auschwitz and the starving children in Gaza are the same. The death camps are the same. The language is the same. Aryan supremacy, Jewish supremacy, white supremacy, it's all the same. Never again can the Jews talk about never again. And that was the whole point of the defeat of Hitler. So the depth of the crime being committed by Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, the government and military of the United States and the Israelis, is almost unfathomable. And last week on a podcast, Trump calls Netanyahu a war hero. Go team. Kill them all. Kill them all. And then we'll build Trump towers. I think I'll say no more and leave us with the depth of that thought to ponder in the depth of our souls, particularly if you're an American or you're a Jew. So thank you, everyone. I'll join the after chat for a bit today, so you're welcome to join me for a deeper discussion. I know these are hard issues to look at. It's like looking at the sun directly with the naked eye. But confront these realities we must, simply to preserve our dignity as human beings. Someone said to me at dinner last night, are you sure you want to talk about these things? Or what if something happens, or what da 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 da? And I said, that does not enter my mind, because ultimately every life is judged not by what the other guy thinks of you. We are judged against eternity. And if we cannot stand up against what's happening in Gaza, we have no dignity. We have only shame. So as long as the genocide continues, and as long as I am able, I will speak my truth into the public commons. So thank you, everyone. You'll see the link to the after chat in the chat box. You receive the link in your Zoom reminders for the day. I'll see you next week. Next week, we're going to have a very interesting conversation with a gentleman who's got very interesting updates on the UAP disclosure situation in our nation's capital. Bye for now. See you next week.